My name is Yesenia Cisneros, and I am the lead producer at Brass Lion Entertainment. And thank you. And today I'm going to be talking to you about production and empathy and how it can help you build a strong studio culture. But first, let me figure out how this thing works, because it's off. Allow me to reintroduce myself, since most of y'all have never heard of me before up until today. So I was born in Queens, New York. My family is from Ecuador and China, which makes me Ecuadorian American with a splash of Chinese. And I've been in this industry for 13 years. My journey into the industry started back in 2009 as an Xbox Live enforcer. And from there, I went over into QA, working on titles as Batman Arkham City, Fear 3, and Mortal Kombat. At that time, I really enjoyed working with people and problem solving and making sure that everyone's talking to each other, working towards a common goal. And so that is when I figured out I wanted to be a producer. But what does a producer actually do? So at that time, when I started my career, I really didn't know what a producer does, since I really didn't know anyone that I can talk to in my circle. I was just starting out, just moved to Seattle after deciding to not be a doctor and moved halfway across the country, disappointing my parents. And then I ended up learning a lot of what I did on the job over many years in the studio. And so today I'm going to briefly chat with you about what a producer does before we get into further details. And where my team members at, all right, I see them here. So a lot of them don't know what I actually do for work. So this is mostly for them so they can start taking notes. There'll be a quiz at the end of this. So a producer, we wear many different hats. We wear the role of being a cheerleader, where we're constantly motivating the team, making sure everyone is high spirits, keeping a pulse on the team health, because we are tracking the day-to-day with everyone. We also do a lot of cat herding, because surprisingly enough, a lot of devs go work on features and then they go into their own little bubbles and silo themselves and don't actually talk to each other. So we have to bring them all together and make sure that they're talking to each other so we can actually do the job right. And we're also constantly removing roadblocks from everyone in order to keep the train moving, just so they don't get blocked, essentially. I like to think of us producers as more of a support role, boosting everyone's performance around us. I also like to look at us as composers, where we're taking all the features individually and bringing them together into one beautiful user experience for our players. So over the many years that I've been doing this, everyone I've worked with has always rolled their eyes at producers. They hate producers. They haven't had good experiences with them. And these are industry vets that have been doing this for 18 to 20 plus years. And not to toot my own horn, but I totally am gonna. Everywhere I've worked, they've told me that I am the best producer they've worked with and the best production team they've ever worked with. So kind of had me wondering, what am I doing so much differently than other producers in this industry? I was leading with empathy. So what does that mean exactly? For me, it comes so natural and second nature for me that I had to really take a step back and think, what does leading with empathy mean, other than making sure the team feels valued and cared for? It sounds pretty simple enough, but a lot of people actually forget that in our industry, especially when you're meeting tight deadlines and trying to get across the finish line. You're working possibly publishers or like anything else, any other factors. So these are kind of some principles that I put together myself, because I was trying to figure out what am I doing differently. And hopefully that'll help some of you today if you're either a producer or wanting to go into production, or maybe you can say, hey, producer in your studio, have you thought about doing this? So first off, show a genuine interest in their work. Devs love talking about their work, and showing that you care about their craft plays attention to detail for them. This not only helps you with learning on the job and learning all the technical jargon and how the game development cycle works, which is how I learned, is by asking a ton of questions. But it also helps you as a producer to put together a roadmap and timeline when you're planning, because now you know how the feature works from end to end, what dependencies there are, and it helps avoid setting any arbitrary dates. Be human. So this is also really simple, yet people forget about this. We as devs are not cogs in a machine. We don't just take a task in and output. So we have to understand that these are real people with real emotions and struggles, and sometimes life stuff happens. And everywhere I've worked in over various industries, it's always been leave your stuff at home and only focus on work. Sometimes that's really difficult to do. You can't just separate them. They're kind of intertwined, especially right now for most of us. We work in a remote environment where our office is our personal home. So what I mean by being human is make sure to put the people first before the work. Encourage them to take a mental health day. Encourage them to go outside for a walk. I know I have to do that sometimes. I also have to take mental health breaks when I just am overwhelmed. And then also, on my team specifically, we have a lot of working parents. We're very cognizant of that, and we make sure it's like, yeah, you need to go take a half day or you need to go take care of your family stuff. Go ahead and do it. Always put people before the work. Next thing is build a connection with your team. Don't make everything be about status updates with them. Don't constantly ask them, what's the status on this? Did you update your Jira or anything like that? And if you'll know that you're this producer if you start, when you ping someone on Slack or any other messaging app, and the first thing they say is, what do you need or what did I do? So if you get those responses, definitely you have to change and pivot to have more non-work conversations. I love roasting my team a lot. I love making fun of them and having jokes, and it's great, and it just kind of helps build that rapport. And something that we did at Brass Line is we implemented coffee time on Mondays, where we meet together as a team, chat for 30 minutes about non-work stuff, and this is how we just catch up on what we did over the weekend. And something our lovely art producer did for us is also set up Donut Time, which is an app that gets integrated into Slack, where you can get randomly paired with another team member. And this also allows for more of the human connection especially that we're not getting right now. And so this is how you build a connection with your team, and it helps build that rapport, which takes us into making it a safe environment. Now, when I say make it a safe environment for everyone, all devs want to feel seen and heard and want to be treated with respect. And so what I've done with everyone is regardless if they're a QA tester or they're a director or whatever, a VP, I've always treated everyone with the same amount of respect. And that has helped build a safe environment for all. So it helps bring their authentic selves every day, and then also they feel a little bit more comfortable talking to you about any other problems that may arise. You want to continue to have that open line of communication with everyone. And lastly, be transparent with everyone. No one likes top-down management, or I like to call pigeon management, where you just kind of swoop in, shit on everyone's idea, and then swoop right off. So I like to be super transparent with my team, even when there's deadlines or I have to pivot on any kind of planning that we originally thought of, anything like that. I always involve them in the process. I explain to them what the situation is, and we work on a solution together. As when you're doing this, all of these stuff, essentially it all adds up together, and they're intertwined, because when the team feels like you have their back, they will have your back. There's been so many times where I have had to solve a hard problem, and I go to my team like, this is really shitty, we need to figure this out. And you know what? More often than not, they're like, yep, Yesenia, we got your back, we're gonna help you figure this out. So in conclusion, don't separate the work from the person. You wanna make sure that you create a sense of belonging for everyone. And even when shit hits the fan, make sure it's even more crucial to follow that, because we all have deadlines, and that's okay. But when that happens, take a deep breath, pause, figure out how you're going to come across and fix a solution. Pause before you respond to someone, because if you say something impulsively or act impulsively, it could create more detriment to the overall goal. And this is how you lead with empathy. Thank you so much.
Hi. Welcome to GDC. Hope you guys are having a great day. My name is Carl Kuo, and today I'm going to talk to you about how behavior drives your culture. I've had the experience and privilege of working at a bunch of mission and values-driven companies that are not showing up completely correctly on this slide, but it's fine. I'm sure you can all LinkedIn stalk me if you wish. Through working at those studios, I've developed a lot of opinions and had a lot of experience of how the words on the web page or on the wall map into what actually is experienced day to day on the culture. And I had the experience of being able to talk to a friend who was thinking of starting their own studio. And I drew this Post-it note, like literally this is a picture of the Post-it note, to start explaining like, hey, yeah, it matters what you put on those places, but what matters more is how you behave and how you think about your behavior in the workplace. And I've given that conversation or that soapbox talk, as I like to call them, a few times, and it sort of morphed into this GDC presentation. It starts with you are what you do. Your behavior is what's going to drive the culture around you at every studio. And a lot of this is because human beings tend to be observational learners. They mimic what they see, they look at how you behave, and they're going to try to emulate it because that's how humans start to understand the social norms around them. When they read the definitions of the words or they read your mission or your value statements, they're going to inform what the actual definitions you're using, what the colloquial definitions you're using through watching your behavior. And it's not just when you're at your best, when you're in presentation mode, during times of stress, during times of crisis, when you're at your worst, when you're thinking about your runway and acting out because you just got off the phone with your investor, that behavior is what people are going to be, these are the bounds of the social norms. This is how I'm going to act. As an example, I was at a studio that had candor as one of their values, and they talked a lot about giving direct feedback and always being very transparent with the people that you interact with as a way to improve the culture. We did stuff during onboarding with this. And I gave a presentation one day to one of the CEOs. And what happened was that during that presentation, the feedback was very positive, overall went well. About a week later, through one-on-one with my manager, I started to get a lot of feedback of, hey, you could have done this better, this wasn't quite working, your presentation skills here weren't great, which was odd because that manager hadn't been in that presentation. And what ended up being the case was a lot of that feedback from that leader, the most senior leadership group, was coming through secondhand. And it started with this leader who did that not just with anyone who came to him, but also all of his direct reports. And in turn, his direct reports saw that behavior and was like, this is what we mean by feedback culture. I will follow in suit. And they began to act in this. And over time, what was represented as candor as culture became more of a, what is the narrative behind my back? What is the feedback I'm going to get unexpectedly weeks after I give a presentation or have a big moment in the studio? You'll notice in that example that it started with one person's behavior and then started to propagate. And this is because you are what you tolerate. As people learn and start to behave within your studio, they're going to not just have behaviors that they're mimicking from people that they see around them, but also we all have habits and behaviors that we've learned from previous studios or even from school. And those habits are going to come in and are going to be default behaviors for people as they're learning the system. If you let those behaviors stand, that starts to map out what are the boundaries of the social norms and will become your culture as well. You have to be present and watching and intervene quickly when behaviors are outside of the boundaries of what you want within your culture. And with kindness, with empathy, as Yesenia mentioned, intervene and course correct that behavior so that it more closely matches the culture you want in your studio. This example has actually happened at multiple studios where you end up in multiple offices, multiple locations, or multiple teams. And oftentimes, studios will talk about wanting to have a one-team culture. You don't want silos between the various game teams or the various locations. At some studios I've had, the language begins to go into shorthand, right? It's very easy to say like, oh, the LA team, or oh, the Montreal team, or that, game 2 team thinks this. The other really common one is leadership thinks this, or management thinks that. And when that language stands, when we all fall into the behavior and it's okay to use that shorthand, we start to develop silos because it's a very othering language. It makes it this amorphous group and everyone thinks the same thing. What we've tried to do at Phoenix Labs, where I'm at today, is try to intervene. When I hear that language, when I go is like, hey, I'm pretty sure the city of Montreal doesn't think that. Who on that team is saying these things, right? Like, how can we get better details there to intervene more quickly if there's an issue? Or who could you connect with specifically in that regard to build a better relationship? Similarly, for, if we're talking about specific game teams or LA, but also, I am, honored to be considered a leader at the studio, and I'll be like, hey, I didn't attend a leadership meeting where we all voted to agree on the same thing and speak with one voice. So could you help me understand where this is coming from? Which leader did you hear that from so that we can better solve the issue? And that has really helped keep us feeling more like one team with fewer walls between locations and between games. In that example, that's a lot of me going and seeing that moment and going and spending one-on-one time to fix it. And this is the sad truth of this that wraps up this talk, which is you are the work you put in, right? There isn't a really easy way to scale this. I can't, unfortunately, I wish I could be like, run these 3 meetings and have these 5 bullet points and you're good, right? Unfortunately, it's about being present and being perceptive, giving direct, timely, and specific feedback every time you notice a behavior that is off course from the culture that you want. Being able to reinforce those pithy statements of your mission and your values with nuance and examples and really give those words more meaning through really specific examples of the behavior. And it doesn't scale, it just requires effort. And ideally, every leader at your organization, and I hope that you have cast that with a wide net of anyone at your studio can be a leader. Hopefully they're all putting this work in. But the only thing you can directly control is you. And so my call to action to you is really, you have to put the time and you have to put the work in to shape the behavior that creates the culture of your studio. And that's my talk. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Christopher Mcchorge. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Wild Blue Studios. We're an external art development partner, and we're a little different than most of the other studios that you'll meet at GDC this week because we are a worker-owned cooperative. That means a few things that I'll talk about today, specifically something we call horizontal structure and vertical deployment. I'll be talking about how we use those two to empower our workers and create a positive company culture. And I'm sure you've all heard of vertical and horizontal structures, vertical being decisions made at the top, handed down to execute, top-down sort of structure. Horizontal, you flatten that a little bit, so some of those decisions are made more laterally, a little more collaboratively. You still have this sort of person at the top or that sort of hierarchy of power. At Wild Blue, we're fully horizontal. We each own an equal part of the studio. Every time we hire another employee, they become another owner. That means that all of our employees then have an equal vote in decisions for things like electing the board. That also means they have an equal vote and power to recall that board. So there's a lot of accountability built into that structure. You'll also notice back in this example, both in the vertical and the horizontal structure, there's the person at the top holding the money bags. In the horizontal structure, because we're all equal owners, we all share equally in the profit, or we call it the patronage, at the end of the year. So that means at the end, we see what our profit is at the end of the year, we reinvest some of that back into the cooperative, and then we take a certain percentage of that, and that gets equally distributed across the studio. Now, we still have vertical deployment, which is going to look a lot more familiar to everyone. We still have we have a board, we have senior leadership, we also have a hierarchy and compensation. So, right, while we are sharing profit equally across the board, we aren't compensated equally. We still recognize differences in skill and experience, and we compensate accordingly. As you sort of move up this vertical deployment, you have greater levels of accountability, responsibility, et cetera. But we think there are a lot of benefits to this flat horizontal structure, right? So it helps to start to dismantle some of those hierarchies that you experience. It makes our senior employees treat our more junior staff as equals, as peers. It really empowers a lot of our junior staff and makes sure that Skill sets are allowed to shine regardless of title. It also has a lot of our senior staff more invested in the growth and development of our junior employees because we share profit. The investment in that individual comes back and is an investment in the whole group. So there's a lot of investment all around, regardless of level of status where you fall in that vertical deployment. So we found these two things together, right? This horizontal structure and this vertical deployment creates a big culture of trust and accountability. The question then becomes, how do you leverage that trust and accountability to make an even more inclusive and happy work environment? We do that in three main ways that I'll talk about briefly today. The first is education, the second is asking and acting, and the third is listen and implement. I'll start with education. So every Tuesday we have an hour set aside where we do workshops, educational workshops. They cover a range of topics, some craft-based, some not. Also recently, the CEO of Wild Blue, Eli Allen, and myself ran all of the members of our studio through a value creation workshop. We were really interested in creating a bigger picture of how we create value in the marketplace, how we differentiate ourselves from competitors, and how we convey that value to our clients. Some of you might be wondering what that has to do with our artists' ability to create good art. Nothing, right? Like the point wasn't to make our artists better at creating art. It was to help them understand how the labor they're performing, how the art that they're creating creates value, how the processes that we use from tools and communication styles create some differentiation from our competitors, and then how we leverage that differentiation, that value that they're creating and participating in, and use that to create good client relationships. We learned a lot in that workshop together, including that some of our most junior members have really good business ideas. And it really helped us refine some of our internal strategies, and also got a lot of internal alignment and buy-in in why we do the things the way that we do, and understand how we operate more broadly out of direct art-based tasks. So creating big pictures for your team members. Next, ask and then act. So we recently conducted a survey where we just asked our team members, our employees, what do you need sort of materially, right? These are some of the questions that were on our survey. But also, where do you want to go? What are your goals? How do you want to get there? And I think at a lot of vertically structured studios or workplaces, you go and you sort of are given the menu of the benefits that are available to you, or there's a pre-established ladder that you climb and expectations for sort of how you're going to get there. But going to your team and asking them, like, what do you need? And how can we help you meet those needs, both materially, but also, professionally, and then helping them build that menu with you. If your studio is predominantly artists or coders in their 20s or 30s, that menu is going to look different than if they're in their 40s and 50s. And sort of meeting your team where they're at is a good way to help build that positive culture. So this was the asking. Here was our action. So this year, we reallocated our budget for marketing and web redevelopment. And we put that towards greater 401k contributions. And we are doing financial literacy training. We hired a financial advisor who's coming in, and during those Tuesday educational workshops is running a series of 3 different workshops where we teach our employees on company time about budgeting, about retirement planning, about investing. We also reassigned some project leadership tasks, allowing some of our more junior members to take greater leadership roles so that they can expand and meet some of those career goals that they identified in those surveys. We also scaled back a little bit some of those responsibilities for some of our more senior or mid-level artists who had been taking on more than was really appropriate for their particular title, or it didn't really align with their career goals. Also, you can't just ask what's wrong. Sometimes you have to listen and find solutions that your team doesn't even know are possible for you to provide. One example is after the start of the pandemic, we started noticing a lot of people were complaining about more wrist pain, more back pain, neck pain, elbow pain. And this isn't that surprising. I'm sure we all spent a lot more time in front of the screen, didn't have the same sort of breaks or movements that we did pre-pandemic. So our solution proactively for this was to order a kit of different exercise equipment, sent it to all of our studio members, and we hired a chiropractor who on Zoom taught us the different a series of stretches and exercises that you can do to help with repetitive stress injuries. Now, every day after our daily stand-up meeting, we do 10 minutes of stretching. Cameras off. But it's a time where we can all come together and invest in one another's health and really make sure that we're creating that culture of care in our company. Now, I've talked about listening and implementing, acting. I've talked about education. But all of this is really built on that foundation of that trust and accountability. And I know the way that we have done that isn't necessarily scalable or replicable for all of you. You can't go back and make all of your employees also owners. But you can go back and interrogate how your systems and structures of power are built and whether or not there's accountability that can be provided to your workers. And then you can retool that and create those opportunities to listen, to act, and to educate, and always empower your workers. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Irene Schultz-Hadavosian. I am the attorney of the group, so naturally my slides are going to have more words on it, but you're not expected to read any of them. They're just for me to present and for viewing. So I'm going to talk about bettering workplace culture in the gaming industry. And I've used what's going to be the outdated version of the saying, happy wife, happy life, to create a more 2022 version of happy employee, happy company, productive business. So why should you listen to what I have to say? So I'm a labor and employment attorney. I literally advise on the issues that we're all talking about. So I advise companies anywhere from small gaming studios to large publishers about how to implement certain policies and practices, or consulting with how to create different structures that really better the workplace, both in the legal concept and in the practical concept. So this is what I do. I also litigate issues that arise in the workplace. So I'll be using some examples as we go through this to discuss, how this plays out in many different companies we've dealt with. Okay, why is a positive workplace culture important? Well, one, you should want your employees to be happy, right? That end in of itself should be enough. But let's say it's not enough. You're the executive of a company, you're focused on your financials. Well, let's talk about how having happy employees gets you to that end, and not having employees actually disrupts that end of having the numbers you need for your business. So one, productivity. At the very end, I will show you some data that shows when your employees are not happy, your business is actually suffering, quantitatively. Two, it's a compliance issue, okay? If your workforce is unhappy for various reasons, and let's say they're legal, it's actionable, it's legally actionable, it's a compliance issue. I mean, you all have seen the headlines, right? I mean, at this point, the US government and state agencies are getting involved in litigating this dispute because they see a problem in the gaming industry. And if anyone here thinks there's not a problem, well, I'm here to tell you as an attorney, there is definitely a problem. Three, if you're a public company, or if you're not, you want to eventually sell your company, it's an investor and shareholder issue. If you want to eventually sell your company, the first thing that's going to get looked at are, you're going to have the due diligence done. Part of that due diligence is the employment practices, right? So they're going to look into that. And how much is what is wrong with the company is going to affect that final number of what you're selling your business for. Number four, doesn't need to be said at this point, it's a PR issue. It's a PR nightmare, potentially depending on how non-compliant the company is. Five, it's an employee retention issue. If your workers are so unhappy that you have a high turnover rate, if you don't realize the amount of money you need to spend to retrain and re-bring on and hire employees, I mean, that cost in and of itself is huge. Six, talent acquisition issue. If you have really great talent that you want to hire, why would they come to a studio that has a reputation for being awful in its practices when they can go to another one that has a positive reputation, right? Number seven, unionization. Full disclosure, I'm an employer side attorney, so unionization, we don't like it, right? My job is to make sure my clients' workplaces are not unionized. It could be a positive thing, but here's why I bring it up, because it's a huge cost for employers to run things through a union. If you are doing things right, you shouldn't need a third party to engage with your employees. Having to go through a third party just raises business costs. Unionization is being talked a lot in the gaming community because clearly there are problems. Okay, so we've heard from all of our speakers about, you can have all the paper that you want, but at the end of the day, if you're not practicing it in real life, it means nothing. So let's think of this as a house, and let's talk about the foundation, because the paperwork is important, but it doesn't trump the actual practice, right? So what are the type of things you should have in place to ensure you get to the next level of having the good house? So the foundation, policies, anti-discrimination, anti-bullying, anti-harassment, anti-retaliation. Consider having an open door policy. Examples of what's something every company should have. An actual reporting procedure, right? Reporting issues to your supervisors and managers. Highly recommend an anonymous hotline for companies that are able to implement it, because sometimes the employee doesn't want, is afraid that no matter how good of a workplace that there is, that them being identified as the complainant will result in certain things. Having an HR team, if the company is, again, large enough for people to report to, and some very large companies have their own investigations team that reports can be sent directly to, internal investigation team. You have to have also an investigation procedure. If you're a smaller company, you refer that out externally for a neutral third party. If you're a large enough company, you could potentially have your HR or designated executive or designated investigation team run the actual investigation. And actually run the investigation, not a fake one, right? There's real investigations and there's ones that are just for show. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, I can do a whole presentation on this. It is so important. I'll get into some of the statistics at the end, but what I'd recommend everyone here do is go look at the Microsoft report on diversity, equity, inclusion, the most recent one. Because if you want a good standard for the possibilities that exist in this workplace and how you can implement things to make sure you have a diverse workforce, their report is pretty excellent. In terms of the one thing I'll mention, for example, job descriptions. Who would have thought that job descriptions could change who's applying to your job? That has been proven to be fact, that if you put certain things in your job description, you are not likely to get diverse candidates, right? Like women, for example. So that could be a major player. Okay, this is the structure. So you built the foundation, you have all the necessary paperwork. Now the structure. Do you actually have a pulse on your people? Do you know what your employees are feeling like? So if you're a smaller company, what you would do is check in with your people directly, right? Every now and then, whether it's every month, quarter. If your employees are generally happy and you know that, you can do it less often, or even then you can do it more often. Surveys. For large companies, I highly recommend anonymous surveys because they're very, very helpful in telling you where problems might be. And you might have a part of the company population that feels really great and a part that's not doing so well. And you might want to look into why is that. Committees, local, regional, national, global, a good example of this. And the committees have to include people from various job titles, right? So you are actually getting what the entire population is feeling. This is actually something I recommended for one of our international companies because they were hearing different things from different countries in terms of how their employees were feeling. And so they actually implemented a global committee with people from various different job titles and actually then got to know better what's going on across different titles and also across their whole universe. So that actually worked out really well from them. Town halls. This is especially good for employees who want to hear from their executives, right? We've talked about, be transparent. Well, let your employees know what's going on, no matter how big or small. Because when your employees feel like they're being communicated to as a last resort, right, you're just telling them what's happening rather than engaging with them and even listening to them about what's happening and taking their feedback and implementing it, that makes them feel different versus, oh, and we're doing this now, and you just have to accept it. Dedicated chief people officer or having a great HR department can change a lot. And again, the whole point of this is employees want to know at the end of the day that their voice matters. All right, and I think this is the point of everyone here has talked about this, right? You can build this great foundation, you can build this great structure, but at the end of the day, if your house just has the foundation and the walls and not the interior to make it feel homey and cozy, you have nothing. I had a big publisher contact us recently to set up all better their structure. And the first thing I said to them is, we're happy to do that for you, but the first thing I want you to do is go talk to your executives and ask them, are they willing to do the things we will recommend? Because if they're not, then I've just given you a whole bunch of paper, right? So every company, if you want to do this, hire, whether it's a consultant or a law firm, yeah, do it, but you have to be willing to go from A to Z, not just have the paperwork. Okay, productivity data. I mean, the data is astounding, right? So in a poll of 1,000 US employees, 64% of workers said the employee experience impacts their ability to serve customers. In a Gallup poll, 80% are not engaged or actively disengaged at work. The lack of engagement costs the global economy $8.1 trillion. I mean, that's crazy. Nearly 10% of GDP in lost productivity each year. Another important one on a poll recently done by some universities really showing how lack of diversity affects companies. A 1% increase in racial diversity, similarity between upper and lower management increases firm productivity by between $729 to $1,590 per employee per year. Lastly, I'll leave you with some demographic data that's honestly a little bit depressing. And one of them includes the GDC report from this year. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to look at it. So that one said 73% identified as male in the video game industry, right? Activision Blizzard, after their accusations, released a report saying 24% of their total workforce is women, whereas in the corporate world, it's 47%, right? Why the disparity? The data shows that there's something wrong. And then another survey indicated that there's, 74% of people feel that there's not equal treatment or opportunity in the gaming industry, and that statistic has worsened over time. So I know I'm ending with the depressing part, but that is all a call to action to all of you, because each of you has a role in this to change it, right? And you got to lay the foundation, you have to have the structure, but you got to put the interior in there and be willing to put it to work. Thank you. Oh, because we were so wonderful, you have to fill out your evaluations. So, should I read the whole thing again? Do you guys know where they are? Okay, you'll find them. Okay, thank you. Yes, we're gonna do a.
Hello?
We're happy to take Q&A.
Yeah.
Just if you line up behind the mics, we'll switch back and forth.
Hi, I've been to 2 different companies that have had, well, I guess technically 3 companies who have had like town hall meetings, town hall style meetings, and I found them generally to be kind of disappointing. Can you give some examples of what you see to be effective or like well structured? What the must-haves are for a good town hall style meeting?
That's a good question. So I would say the bad ones are where people are talking at you, right? And the good ones are where there's a conversation. If a company is big enough to have the tech to be able to do it, you could have people simultaneously polling via their phones or some other tech, right? live as it's happening so the feedback is coming in, but you could also just have it be a conversation, right? Like let people speak to a certain extent. You might not be able to get to everyone, but a good town hall is not just communicating information, but taking feedback. So if you're doing a town hall where you're just communicating information as the employer, that's not a town hall, that's just a meeting, right? So a very high level, that's the most, I think, important thing.
I would also add that what I've seen most in town halls is that when they scale, they can often scale poorly. And so often what you'll run into is as town halls scale, the authenticity of both questions and answers drop. What I would suggest there is one, just be aware of that problem and be thinking about it. Two, a lot of it is on the folks who you send out to do the leadership side of the town hall, reinforce the authenticity of answers. Don't pre-prepare answers. Don't treat it as a quoting fingers rude Q&A, but instead really try to bring their whole selves and be present and listening to the questions, and don't try to change the questions and the questions they want to answer. And then third, just be ready to split up town halls when the scale gets too big and be really transparent about why you're doing that. Don't hide town halls or make it feel like people can't see all of the town halls that happen, but from an interaction standpoint, scale it wider so that it feels more authentic. Cool.
Hi. This one is mostly sort of directed at Christopher. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned trust and accountability as a big part of what you do in your studio to make the horizontal structure work. I come from like mutual aid organizing and other sorts of non-work organizing work where a lot of things are horizontal, and trust and accountability is something I feel like I've struggled even when there's no money involved, no employment involved, nothing of that sort. I was wondering if you had any stories of successes in someone being accountable for something that they have done.
First I'll say I think it's almost harder when there's not money and it's all volunteer based, because it's easier to sort of opt out of those engagements than it is if it's your job. But an example of success of holding someone accountable. Let's see. Trying to think of one that I can share. I'll say that we had, let's say, a new client project that we were starting, and there were some sort of communication pitfalls along the way. Some things were sort of dropped, and at the end of the day, we had to, gather around the wagons and like hold people accountable and point out like where we had sort of evaluate where we had fallen a little short in building up that, especially a new relationship. I think new relationships always require more energy as you're building that. And I think one of the things that we do is, always approach that accountability not as like a trial, right? But as an opportunity to do better the next time. So it wasn't like yelling, you did this. It was like, hey, here's some problems where we think this went wrong. Here's how we can do better the next time. And, you always give that person, you got to give that next time though, right? But it also helped us even retool the way that we approach current client relationships. And so we became like an educational moment, not just in how we onboard new clients, but making sure that we give even better experiences to our existing ones. And it's because we're able to have those open conversations and hold one another accountable. But that accountability doesn't look like punishment. And I think that that's really important.
Hi. My question is about the vertical horizontal system, especially when a team is growing or trying to scale up. What kind of issues would you foresee like needing to tackle, or like how would you prepare yourself and your team to face any like issues that do arise if like the team is growing really fast while trying to maintain that sort of structure and trust and accountability?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. We last year hired 4 new people, so we went from a team of 6 to a team of 10 as kind of core members. And when you have suddenly 40% of your studio is new and doesn't know what the culture is or what it looks like, or a lot of the sort of casual conversations you've been having with each other, suddenly you need to like teach other people those conversations. So I think good documentation helps here to be able to point them to that. But this gets to, I think, everything, a kind of common thread that we've been saying throughout today is that documentation is great, but it's more about what you do, like Carl was saying, or how you demonstrate empathy, like Yesenia was saying, or, building that foundation, but actually filling it with things like Irene was saying. So, all those things are important to have in place, but as you scale, especially making sure that you have systems in place that allow you to onboard those new team members and know that that onboarding takes time. And making sure that you're building in, particularly if you have process or pipeline things and deadlines, that you're going to need time to build culture just as much as you need time to build assets.
First, I really just wanted to thank all of you for sharing your experience and your perspective on this really important topic. Sorry to get emotional. I just think it's really important for us to have this conversation so that we can all work together to build an industry we're all super proud of. So thanks. Second of all, I was curious if you all had any more thoughts about or suggestions about how to build a strong culture with a distributed team, right, where everyone's not all in the same room. Thanks.
I'm glad you asked. So I'll talk a little bit about Brass Lion Entertainment. I feel like we have a really strong studio culture, and it's something really precious to me because as we continue to grow our team, that's something that we constantly look at in terms of like who we bring in. And so some things that we do, as I mentioned, we do scheduled coffee time where 30 minutes every Monday we talk to each other. We also have this thing, because I like naming conventions, but I have this thing that's called Film Fridays, Fun Fridays, and I also have Feeling Fridays. So I kind of like put these in place to kind of help build that connection with everyone. And so every Friday we'll watch a movie together on, over Zoom, or we'll play a game together, or we'll actually talk. I call it Feelings Fridays because this is where it allows us to have more transparent and more honest conversations with each other based on like, hey, I read this article. Can we all talk about it as a group? And I think another thing that makes our culture, our studio so strong is the fact that we're so diverse and we can have more honest conversations a lot faster than any other studio I've worked at, where there is no ego and there's no like hard feelings. No one's feelings getting hurt. And so because we make it a safe environment, we're all able to talk to each other. So I think like pretty much it goes the way I build that culture is that having that empathy in production adds on to that essentially. So it's like making sure you're talking to your team members, making sure that you're interacting with them. That's not always work. Getting to know your team members, and checking in on them is such a big deal. Just because it's like, man, I really wish other people gave a shit about me when I first started 13 years ago. And that's like such a big thing now because that's what makes my team happy. It's that they feel seen, that they feel heard, and they're involved in the process. And I'm very transparent with them. So that's what I do, at least from my side. I don't know if anyone else has something else to add.
Yeah, so Wild Blue's always been a fully remote team. There are 10 of us, but we operate out of 7 different states. Discord is sort of our home base, right? Or Slack sometimes. But I think part of that is creating spaces where you're doing like non-production things. So some of those, like we have our Education Tuesdays. Every Wednesday we do a Twitch stream together where we just offer free portfolio reviews for anyone who wants to swing by. We do things like that just sort of help us be part of a broader community, but also build community together. I think it's also really important to like plan fun because you don't have those moments when you come together like at the water cooler or the lunch table or so I've done things like ask everyone to send me their favorite pump up song. I've made a Spotify playlist, send it out to everybody. Everyone listens to the playlist and tries to guess who's who. And then we send like a coffee to whoever. I really like Found Familiar coffee. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but they do like gaming art, support the board game community. And so we just send a bag of that to whoever like gets the most right. And I'll come up with like different sort of things like that all the time. We just always send out coffee, so like just ways to kind of create fun and have people engage, but also like learn more about one another. So it's sort of like a fact-finding mission about one another. So you learn a little about what people's music tastes are, or what your favorite Halloween movie is, but then like that kind of guessing and having to ask and like evaluate. That has nothing to do with production. and everything to do with like building those relationships?
Lots of things, but I think the most important thing right now, or one of the most important thing, is inclusion. Making sure you have a diverse and inclusive workforce. It's clearly a huge problem in the industry, and oftentimes you hear, "Oh, well, there are not enough female engineers or like game developers." Well, then solve the problem, right? A good example is USC, for example. I think in their recent class had more female game developers than male. And they've been really pushing for that. So there's one way of doing it. But if you make an effort to do it, I guarantee you can have an inclusive workforce.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add, in addition to sort of the recommendations that have come up, which I think come back to, we take for granted very often the social norms and the easy ways we have of doing things in person because we're so used to it. It's all habitual. And so making sure that you really think about and be present for what are you lacking in distributed environments, and you have to put the work into making those moments happen, whether it's, calling attention time for outside of work conversations, building and stretching time, that kind of stuff. Finding those social moments where people can find belonging, find connection is super important. The other piece that I would do that I see a lot of companies and a lot of individuals miss is that really making it everyone's problem, really bringing everyone into the fold of that challenge. Everyone owns a piece of that, right? Like how I show up to work in an office is I contribute to everyone else's happiness around me, and it should be no different in a distributed environment. And so don't try to solve it just at a leadership layer or just at a production layer, right? Really bring that problem to every member of your team and be like, hey, how can we make this better? How can we better capture presence? How can we better capture belonging, right? Like what are we missing? What gaps do you see? And bring everyone into solving the problem.
I also really like to roast my team and stand up. That is all.
Everyone appreciates a good roast. I think we're on that side.
Yeah, I'm wondering what your thoughts are around some of the like more systemic, pernicious or like leadership issues around culture, where folks who may not have positions of power, what sorts of things would you recommend or suggest to folks who really feel powerless to influence positive workplace culture?
I mean, that is the hard answer that I would give you is you have a lot of power, right? If you feel powerless, you do have a lot of power. You should use your voice, and you should use your actions, and you should try to safeguard your behavior. And I know that I recognize that in late stage capitalism, which we can all enjoy, it doesn't always feel like that, and there are real consequences to those actions. But at the end of the day, I think we find ourselves in a time where the voice of every worker is more listened to than ever before, and you have a lot of power. And if you find yourself in a leadership position or transitioning into a leadership position, really holding that accountability on yourself to act in the way that we all aspire to have the great game industry that we can all be super proud of, and holding that near and dear to your heart, and holding your fellow leaders accountable, right? But if you feel powerless, I as someone who does a lot of recruiting in their life, I can tell you that the job market will reward you deeply for using your voice and using your action to find a better studio. And that is the most powerful way you can give a message to the leaders of your studio that it's not acceptable anymore.
Awesome. Hi. So I was wondering how you deal with the risks of changing kind of culture building tactics or techniques too quickly or too often. So the context here is to create that safety, that culture of safety. People don't want the rug constantly pulled from under them. And I wonder, how you approach that idea of you see something going wrong, how long do you kind of slowly change it versus being like, hey, not doing that anymore. Here's what we're doing now.
So your question is, if something's going wrong, like how do we go about changing it instead of like whether we do it fast or we do it slowly, kind of like?
Yeah, and I guess just mitigating the risk of if you change things too much too often, people will start to feel unstable.
So I can speak on from the production side of things, just because we do this a lot. We're constantly having to pivot, especially not just with the project itself, but also in process as well. As I mentioned earlier, like everywhere I worked at, there's no process that fits every studio, and even within the studio, each team, they all have the different processes. So like what I do with my production team, and my art producer's here, so I'm calling her out as well. She's amazing at her job, so just giving kudos to her. But something that we really do is we really listen to the team on the production side. It was like, okay, what's not working? We have retrospectives after each sprint. And we don't have it just to have retrospectives. We actually do stuff about it because our team actually gives us feedback of like what didn't work and what did work. And so usually what I do is take that feedback and I do it incremental changes, especially in process, because when I'm doing, for example, if I'm in pre-production versus actual production, I change the formality of things. So I do it very incremental of like, okay, I'm gonna change this one little thing and then, okay, see how that works, and then we're gonna change it again. So one concrete example I can give is we're all remote and our team size has grown. And as our team has grown, our sprint and our planning days have gone really long. And so I can see as we were doing it, everyone's eyes was glossing over. I'm like, okay, we need to change this. And everyone's feedback is like, it's getting too long. We have too many people. So instead of changing everything all at once, I was like, okay, first off, let's just do this one little thing and see how it goes. Let's break it up into segments and give everyone breaks and be like an hour, 30-minute breaks in between like planning sessions versus like review sessions and retrospectives and et cetera. And so I did that. And so now I'm kind of testing. The reason why I bring it up is because I'm still testing the waters. And so far the schedule change that I did with the team was working really well. And so now I'm going to evaluate and be like, okay, what other changes do we need to do? So I recommend going incremental and kind of like testing, see how it goes out and then do it. Because if you do too many changes, in my experience, everyone's like, oh my God, that's too much. And then they're overwhelmed and then they like shut down and you don't want that.
I also think be transparent with your people. And if you need to go through some trial and error to get to the optimal result, and if your employees know that out front, right, we're going to try this. Maybe it's awful and it doesn't work for our team. It might work for some other company. Okay, that didn't work, but let's try. And again, don't do it too quickly, right? Because people need to take a breath before you go to the next one. If you implement it without talking to them, then most likely they're going to be unhappy. Or again, people don't like things happening to them. They want to be involved. Right? When they're involved and they feel like they're part of the process, even if maybe it's changing quickly, you'll probably have a better result than if you're changing it and everyone's just sitting back trying to hang on for, their life. Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Ask for criticism too, right? Like if you're going to implement a new process, tell them what that new process is and find out who your biggest critic is and get their like worst complaints about it and try to actively solve those before you roll out full implementation. We did this recently where we completely changed how we handle our review process and even the platform that it takes place in. And our art director straight up told us he hated it and didn't want to do it, right? And we're like, tell me why, like, break that down, like unpack that hatred for me a little bit so I can understand it. And then like, I can work to solve that and make you not hate it. And if you still hate it at the end of the day, we can go back to the way things were before. But we have to do something that's different. And like, let's try this together rather than like, this is sort of that like don't hand down that decision and like stamp it as the way it's going to be because you'll just meet much more resistance that way.
Yeah. The main thing I would add to that is I think it's when you're being transparent about the why and why you're making that decision as much as possible, bring people into the problem in that way, right? And two, gauge how reactive you're being. And the best way I found for me to deal with that is to do as much scenario planning up front of like, hey, how will I know it's going bad? Or how will I know I'm in scenario A or B? And what would I do if I was there? And that also helps you potentially bring more people into the problem of like making it more transparent about why reactions are happening. And if you find yourself in a place where you've changed a couple times and you haven't found the right answer, exposing the next set of scenarios can help people understand like, there's a plan. We're not just being reactive. And I find that idea that like, hey, it's not just reacting to the moment, but being thoughtful about the whole situation and then being brought into the problem can help increase the amount of change that people can onboard at a time. but you always have to like temperature check that with the humans involved. And the only thing I would say in your specific wording of your question is, if it's a severe problem, don't wait. Like, it's better to deal with the problems of fast change management than really severe problems, and just always gauge that.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Cool. You guys are rock stars. Thank you.
Oh,
This is awesome. The previous answers I maybe are going into what I'm going to ask, but what if your team over the course of quarantine and just remote work transitioning to this new hybrid work style, how have you been able to catch your maybe bad habits or culture, or like culture transitioning and adjusting in a way that's not good for the workplace? How do you snip it, or how do you like adjust it and push it to start kind of adjusting towards your goals of your studios?
I think from my perspective, it's really about being I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it's about being really direct, timely, and specific in the feedback and in the moment, and catching it and investing that time, right? Don't wait for it to fester. Don't spend too much time in analysis paralysis of how you'll fix it, but instead be like, hey, this is what I'm seeing. I feel like this is going off course. Let's have a conversation about it, but I'd really like to readjust us to this, or this, right? And it kind of depends on the severity of the issue and what you're seeing. And is it small behaviors? Is it big behaviors? To the example I gave in the talk of like, if it's othering language, right? Like just being able to call it out and put a spotlight on it in a nice way, right? Like not in a way that is accusatory or make someone feel defensive, but just be like, hey, we're using shorthand and that probably doesn't work for us. So let's be more specific so we can actually action on whatever you're seeing. Moments like that can really do it. But a lot of it is you just have to jump in there and start addressing it as soon as you see it and as specifically as possible.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yo, hello. I want to say thank you for your presentation. I really like Yesenia's point about not necessarily having to leave your life at home and you can bring it to work with a community. My question comes from Game Heads, where we teach students how to build video games 15 to 25 ages. We have students who are virtual and hybrid in person. We have introverts who act like extroverts and extroverts who act like introverts. My question is, how do you cater activities, town hall meetings, social gatherings so that everybody's engaged and included?
So your question is, how do you interact and engage with everyone when they have all these different kind of backgrounds, and how they interact, and like making sure everyone feels included?
Yeah, different personalities and energies, young and yeah.
Oh man, so I can only speak to a little bit about this because I feel like on our studio, the production team handles this very well. It's a challenge, definitely, for sure, because there's a lot of times where we're having like, originally, here's an example. So originally when I did Coffee Time, it was 30 minutes, all of us in one room together in Zoom where we talk to each other. And we realized the extroverted, the loud person that constantly likes to talk, we were taking over the room in the call. And so we had to figure out, okay, how do we bring in more conversations into the fold? And so I kind of like was watching and listening to people and getting their feedback in the retrospectives. And then I pivoted where it's like, okay, we're spending 15 minutes of it, all of us kind of catching up together. And then the next 15 minutes is actually, I randomly assign everyone breakout rooms. So this way it makes it a little bit more intimate groups, and the people who want to talk have a chance to speak, so they don't feel like they're getting overpowered by people like me, essentially. I totally am calling myself out here. And so it's really trying to find out what the problem is, and like what are people's, it's really about listening to your team. It's like, okay, what do they need? What are the problem? And asking the why, like, okay, why do you feel this way? Because once you find out why, you can kind of figure out, okay, how do I fix this? And so I work really, really closely with my production team in figuring out what do we need to adjust and pivot on, and how can we accommodate everyone else while giving. Yeah, unfortunately, I know we're not going to be able to fix everyone and make everyone happy. I wish I could, but at least as long as I'm like 90, 95% there, I'm doing great. All is well in my world.
For your specific situation, I would also encourage almost teaching a session on facilitation exercises and facilitation skills, right? And in that way, you can help bring many of those students into the problem of like, hey, this is facilitation is a skill, being able to pay attention to Zoom, being able to do active listening is a skill. And so one, putting a spotlight on that, but then also giving some folks at least the bare bones basics of that can then help for everyone to be more of an active facilitator during those conversations. I also find that it's about having a variety of activities, not a one size fits all, right? Like you're never going to be able to create a single Zoom meeting that solves for all the extroverts and all the introverts and all the people who are Star Wars versus Star Trek nerds or, whatever combination you want to throw in there. And so things that we found is where you have Zoom meetings that will tend to be taken up by people who are more reactive, active speakers, right? Like if you have the ability to do stuff where people can prepare their thoughts ahead of time, like during retros, we set up a Miro board where people can start putting their thoughts ahead of time. It allows people who are slower processors to put that stuff ahead of time. And then also having room where teams will often do just like, hey, we're going to go hang out in Discord. And that change in vibe of an active meeting where you almost feel performative in a Zoom versus just chilling in Discord while we all work allows different voices to come to the fore. And you sort of have to do a little bit of all of it, and you have to know who the facilitators within your group are to make sure that they're watching for it as well. But the more facilitators you can have, the more successful you'll be.
I got to run, everyone, because I have a flight to catch, but if you need to reach out to me, feel free. You guys are assuming are hanging on.
Yeah, we'll take this one last question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, did you do? Okay, I got it. Never mind.
Hi, yes. First off, I want to thank you guys. Great talk. And especially thank you for talking all about like transparency. I feel like I'm so annoyed at like just not even just in the games industry, but just in general life about everyone like dancing around subjects and just like not talking about what they feel. Like me and my friends were talking the other day, like one of them said something and it said the other one, they actually had a conversation about it. It was totally resolved and was very refreshing. But the question I wanted to ask is, you guys talked a lot about those like town halls and getting feedback and kind of like gauging how things are going from your teams and stuff like that. And I've been in situations a lot where I go to my team and I'm like, hey, how's everything going? What are things that people are like doing things? And like, it seems like things are going wrong, but then just no one says anything. So how do you kind of like draw people to actually talk about things that they're worried about?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's a very big topic. The piece that I would say to sort of broach it is a lot of that comes down to people are going to speak up in places that they feel safe and that they have a lot of trust and belonging. And so if you find that folks in group settings are not doing that, then there's probably work to be done in building the overall trust within the group. There's that is in and of itself probably 3 GDC talks, but really starting with understanding, hey, how can we build trust and belonging within this group? And that's going to start at smaller scales, right? Like you're not going to be able to pull everyone into a single room and do some trust falls and it'll be all good. But, just slowly working on that problem. And that kind of starts with you yourself, making sure that you have the trust of the people in the room. And so even if you can't get feedback in a group setting, can you get it in individual setting? And if you're still having to pull really hard or not getting or you overhear people complain about things outside of your line of sight, it's like, okay, how can I build up my trust, build up my credibility with this group, make them feel safe and part of the crowd? Because once they feel trusted and belonging to the group, they'll be much more open and candid with that stuff. And that's a very long journey, but it's a worthwhile one, and there's a lot of techniques out there.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's all about setting those belonging cues with your team, making them feel safe, because that's at the core value. Everyone wants to feel safe, and if they don't feel safe, they're not willing to talk to you or speak up. And so kind of that's where my talk was mostly about, is just building that environment where people can talk to you and they enjoy working with you and they'll tell you about stuff. And because of that, I've had those situations where my team members tell me everything, even if it's not in a large setting, they'll feel safe enough to talk to me individually about issues. And it's a lot of, especially for us on the production side, it's a lot of like observing and noticing. And we have like our ears to the ground at all time. Like we know what's happening at all moments. And so just being observant as well too, like listening, checking in on your team, as I mentioned, really helps with that as well too. Because then you'll know like something's off. Let me go check in on this person.
I'd say it's also, this is sort of, it's easier to sort of build trust than it is to repair trust. And so if you're operating in a system where that trust has already been violated and people don't feel like there is that accountability, or that they'll be heard, or they don't feel like there's that relationship already there, that's a lot more difficult of environment to go into than if you're sort of starting fresh. But if that is the case for your environment, then you still have to start somewhere in that sort of reparative journey. But as they were both saying, it takes time, and it takes even longer if that's already been violated. So
Well, luckily, it's not there yet.
And this is totally not a sponsored advertisement for this, but I recommend this book called The Culture Code, where us at Brass Line, we read it and we talk about it, and it's great. And it talks about setting those belonging cues with your team members to make sure that they feel valued and heard. So it's called Culture Code. You can get it on Amazon. This is not a sponsored message.
Or at your local bookstore.
Oh!
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.